For my thoughts on all the latest happenings in the NFL in a completely relaxed, unscripted format, be sure to check out my channel, JG9 News. And now, on with our feature presentation. If you followed my channel or JG9 News, you know that I have my, shall we say, gripes with the schedule this year. There are a lot of things about the 2024 NFL schedule that I really do not like, and think the NFL got horribly wrong. For example, the Pittsburgh Steelers and the Chicago Bears not playing any divisional games until Week 11 for some reason. The New York Jets being on national television 7 times in the first 11 weeks. The NFL coming out and saying that they don't want to have the same matchups over and over again during Week 18. And yet, putting the Commanders against the Cowboys and the Eagles against the Giants for the 3rd straight season. The 5 possible Saturday games for Week 17 looking like ridiculously terrible matchups on paper, even more so than the previous 2 years when looking at it from a winning percentage standpoint. I could go on and on, but you get the idea. There are lots of things with the NFL schedule that I feel don't make a lot of sense in more ways than one. However, what do I expect the NFL to do about it? Absolutely nothing. The schedule is out, and what's done is done. This is what we've got. Speaking of what we've got close to 60,000 subscribers on this channel, so be sure that you hit that like button, subscribe, and turn on notifications so you don't miss a moment of the action when we post, because we're trying to build the best football community on this platform to talk about all things NFL history. Thanks in advance for your support. But now, I want you to imagine the NFL the day after the schedule coming out saying, "Oh crap, we made an error. That wasn't supposed to happen." And they decide to change a portion of the schedule. They decide, you know what? Having the Baltimore Ravens play on Christmas on the road in back-to-back years is pretty unfair. So we're taking that game off Christmas and changing that around. Or they decide, you know what? We're swapping one of those designated Saturday games that looks terrible and one of those Sunday games just so that we have better options to potentially show in front of a national audience. It's not anything crazy like reworking the entire schedule, but it is a notable and significant change to say the least. Well, in 1968, that's exactly what happened in the American Football League with the Miami Dolphins and the Buffalo Bills, when not even 24 hours after the AFL schedule was released for the year, the league decided to change it because something didn't seem right. And this is the story behind the bizarre switch. Before I talk about the game in question and what the issue was, we need some context to understand the 2 teams playing in the game, just to give some idea of what we're working with here. It's Sunday, October 13th. It's week 6 of the AFL season, and as we're in the swing of things, we've got a battle in the AFL East on our hands at this venue right here down at the Orange Bowl, between the Buffalo Bills and the Miami Dolphins. Unfortunately for football fans, both of the teams playing in this game, as you're about to tell, absolutely stunk. Starting with this team right here, the home team Miami Dolphins. I think to say that their life as a professional football team started off incredibly rough would be putting it lightly, as the Dolphins were not even the slightest bit competitive in 1966 and 1967, winning just 7 games combined across the 2 seasons and spending a grand total of 7 days above 500. And the 1968 season was not starting off any better for them, I'll put it that way. Through their first 4 games, the Dolphins were 1-3, which started with a 24-10 loss against the Houston Oilers in a game that you can learn more about by clicking the card in the upper right corner, and continue with blowout losses against Oakland and Kansas City. The Dolphins had an abysmal offense, as through their first 4 games, they had scored just 58 points, or 14.5 points per game, which was the 2nd worst total in football, only better than the Denver Broncos. And they had an abysmal defense, allowing 114 points, or 28.5 points per game, which was also the 2nd worst total in football. The Dolphins also had a point differential of -68, which was, you guessed it, the 2nd worst point differential in football. And while I don't want to say that it looked like the New York Jets were looking in prime position to run away with the East Division, The Dolphins absolutely needed to win this one as they were falling off the pace. If they didn't win this one, their season would be over barring a complete miracle, seeing as back in 1968, you had to win your division to make the playoffs. As a side note, to learn more about how bad the 1968 Dolphins were, because I've done quite a few videos on this team, click the card in the upper right corner. But remember how with a lot of those stats, I said that the Dolphins were the second worst team in football? That's because the one team worse than them was, as it turned out, this team right here, their opponent, the Buffalo Bills. You could legitimately make the argument that the 1968 Bills were the worst team in American Football League history. And I wouldn't disagree with you. I could talk about a bunch of different things with the Bills, from the bizarre injury to Jack Kemp in the dumbest and stupidest way possible that eventually led to their head coach getting fired 2 games into the season, to the fact that they were so desperate at quarterback that they literally petitioned the armed forces to let someone not enlist in Vietnam so he could suit up at quarterback for a few weeks. Just know that they were really, really bad. However bad and dysfunctional you thought your worst season ever was, unless you were a fan of a team like the 2007 Falcons or the 2021 Jaguars, amplify that by 100, because that's what the Bills were in 1968. By this point, the Bills were 1-4. They had the worst point differential in the AFL at -71, and they had the worst defense in the AFL by allowing 151 points, or well over 30 points per game. Just how bad were the Bills? In one particular game in Week 2, a 48-6 loss to the Oakland Raiders, the Bills finished the game with -19 passing yards. Yes, you heard that right. -19 passing yards. You, watching this video right now, whether you were alive back in 1968 or were not, had more passing yards on that day than the Bills did. So when it came to this game right here between the two teams down at the Orange Bowl, no one was expecting much of anything. However, remember what I said about the original date of the game? Sunday, October 13th, with a 2 o'clock Eastern start time? Heck, you can see it right here in the Miami Herald when the schedule dropped in late April. Seems pretty reasonable and ordinary, right? Every team in the NFL and AFL plays games on Sunday afternoon, with some minor exceptions here and there like prime time and the occasional Monday night game to test the waters before Monday Night Football officially became a thing in 1970, which you can learn more about by clicking the card in the upper right corner. However, there was one small problem if the Dolphins and the Bills played this game on October 13th. And no, it had nothing to do with any other scheduling conflicts taking place in the city or the stadium that the American Football League was unaware of. Instead, it had to do with the weather. Because in the eyes of Dolphin officials, when they saw the AFL release their schedule, they threw a fit because it was grossly unfair. Not because the Dolphins had 4 road games in a row, or a stretch where they played 6 road games in 7 weeks. And not because they had a week 1 bye, despite the fact that there were 10 teams in the league, and therefore, no need to have a bye during the opening week. Rather, they were upset that this game right here was being played on Sunday afternoon, because it could potentially be too hot. Back in 1968, revenue was generated way more through attendance than it was other things like television contracts. Games were not even shown on local television if the team was playing at home. If you were within a 75-mile radius and wanted to watch your Dolphins play, even if the game was sold out, unless you were physically at the game, you couldn't do it. Heck, if you wanted to watch the Super Bowl, you couldn't even do it if it was in Miami. And because the AFL recognized this, and recognized that playing games in September was going to be suboptimal for fans to show up to the Orange Bowl in, the league scheduled 3 games on Saturday night, with the idea being that in October, they'd be able to play on Sunday afternoon again. That was the AFL's strategy in 1966 and 1967 at the very least. The strategy was to have the Dolphins play on Friday and Saturday nights to start the year off, which was, as you can imagine, highly controversial because it impacted local high schools. But that was the way to beat the heat. In 1966, the Dolphins played the Denver Broncos on a Sunday afternoon on October 16th, winning that game 24-7. And in 1967, the Dolphins played the New York Jets on a Sunday afternoon on October 22nd, losing that game 33-14. As for the attendance for those two games, it wasn't great. The Bronco game drew just 22,191 fans to the Orange Bowl, a stadium that held over 70,000 spectators. This was a decrease of over 11,000 fans from their most recent home game before this. That game before the Bronco game was a game against the New York Jets, which drew 33,650 fans. But when the Jets came back to Miami in 1967 in a game played on a Sunday afternoon, the game drew just 28,392 fans, or 5,000 fewer fans than their most recent home game before that against the Kansas City Chiefs. If we look at the average attendance for the Dolphins over their first two seasons, that bar for games played on a Sunday afternoon in October is ever so slightly lower than the games played any other time and day. Now obviously, that might not look convincing. That's a difference of about 1,000 fans. But if we look at their attendance for the Bronco game in 1966 versus 1967, and the Jet game in 1966 versus 1967, you see a pretty clear difference between the game played on a Sunday afternoon in October and a game played at a different time. Again, we're dealing with a sample size of just 2 here across the 2 seasons, but there's definitely a noticeable pattern that games taking place on a Sunday afternoon in October, when it is still hot outside and can be above 80 degrees, do not draw well compared to night games. I should also note that even past October, for whatever reason, even as it got cooler, the Dolphins struggled getting crowds on Sunday afternoon compared to earlier in the season. But at the same time, the Dolphins had nothing to play for by that point, so that could just be a case of correlation, not equaling causation. So with that in mind, the Dolphins immediately criticized the schedule and petitioned the AFL to change it so that the Dolphins-Bills game was taking place on Saturday night instead. The problem with the Saturday night game was the Sport Broadcasting Act of 1961, which stated that in October, if there was any college football game taking place within a 75-mile radius anywhere in the country, the game could not be shown on television in that area. That's the relevant portion at least, but if you want to know why the NFL doesn't do Friday night games during the season, or Saturday night games until college football is done, that's why. They legally cannot show the games on TV otherwise. And if you want to know why the NFL plays on Black Friday and gets around it that way, that's because so long as the game is over by 6 o'clock local time, you're good. And that game starts at 3 o'clock Eastern. Anyways, if the game was going to be moved, then no one in Buffalo would be able to watch, even though Buffalo was the road team, and their fans had no way of attending the game unless they flew down to Miami. AFL President Milt Woodard had to decide which evil to go with. The evil of not being able to show the game in Buffalo, or the evil of having Miami's attendance suffer tremendously. Either way, you're going to tick off people, although it seems grossly unfair to Buffalo to move the game because number one, it was originally scheduled for that day, number two, no one could watch it now in the local market, and number three, other teams with brutal heat had played on Sundays before and had done just fine. The Houston Oilers played home games on Sundays in October outdoors at Rice Stadium before they moved to the Astrodome, and noticed no difference with their attendance. So this seemed like a Miami fanbase issue more than anything else. Again, no matter what Woodard decided to do, he was going to receive some backlash. But he decided at the end of the day to reward the home team, and decided that the home team was more important than having the game shown on television in the away market, even if a college football game was going to be played the day before between LSU and Miami, making the field potentially not the best at the Orange Bowl. And with that, after the schedule was released, one day later, it was changed, with the AFL admitting that they made a mistake. Instead of just playing 3 Saturday night games in September, the Dolphins would now have one of those Saturday night games in October to go along with that. And just to confirm, no, the game was not shown on local television anywhere. It couldn't be shown in Miami because of blackout rules, nor could it be shown anywhere else in the country, including Buffalo, because of the Sport Broadcasting Act of 1961. The home crowd won over the television crowd. As for what happened in the game that you've been watching this whole time, and the game between these two teams behind me right here, the Buffalo Bills and the Miami Dolphins, being the two awful teams they were, ended up tying the game 14-0 in a pretty evenly matched game, all things considered. Buffalo was trailing 14-6 late in the fourth quarter, but a touchdown and a two-point conversion ended up tying the game late. Remember that in the AFL, the two-point conversion existed. This was the last glimpse of success for Buffalo, as they finished the season with a 1-12-1 record, losing their final 8 games of the year after this to finish with the number 1 pick in the draft. From an attendance standpoint, the game drew over 28,000 fans, which is not great, but it is better than their 2 Sunday October games in 1966 and 1967. Now, was that enough to outweigh the cons of not airing the game on TV and not showing it in Buffalo? Well, that's for you to decide. The early days of the Miami Dolphins prior to Don Shula were extremely interesting and chaotic, and this is just one somewhat forgotten example of that deserves a deep dive more than half a century later. The fact that the Dolphins petitioned the AFL after the schedule came out to issue a retraction and move a game from Sunday afternoon to Saturday night, even though it would mean no television anywhere in the country, and the fact that the AFL said, "You're right, we screwed up, our apologies," and it actually worked? It's nuts looking back at it. Because in 1968, even though the Dolphins didn't beat a lot of opponents, they did find a way to beat the Heat. Get your official Jaguar Gear 9 merchandise by going to jj9shop.com, and be sure to like and subscribe, as it really helps the channel out a lot. Join me every Wednesday night where we'll play NFL Trivia for cash prizes at 9 p.m. Eastern over on Twitch. To learn more about the history of college football, subscribe to Jaguar Gator 8. To learn more about the history of Major League Baseball, subscribe to Jaguar Gator 7. Also, special thanks to all of our Patreon supporters for helping out the channel. Your support is greatly appreciated. See how you can become a patron and request future video topics in the description below.